Hello and welcome to tonight's panel discussion, Challenging Curations and the Contemporary Viewer, chaired by Dr. Edwin Kumasaru with Alice Procter, John Sleigh and Matt Smith. My name is Nerissa Taysom and I manage the public programme at the Watts Gallery Artists Village, and I'm delighted to be welcoming tonight's speakers on this very warm evening. And wherever you are joining us from, thank you for joining the What's at Home programme. Before I introduce Edwin and say a few words about tonight's talk, just a few practical notes. This talk will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions during the talk, and we'll monitor this throughout and chair a discussion at the end. And just to note that questions can be anonymous. If you have any technical issues, please email me on the address which will be shared in the chat box shortly. If there are any major issues during the talk, we may pause for 5 minutes and then relaunch using the Zoom link. A reminder that this talk is being recorded and may be used on our website following the event, but please do not record on your own devices. And lastly, if you're enjoying the discussion, please let us know via Twitter and Instagram at Watts Gallery. We'd love to hear from you. Tonight is the final talk in this series to accompany our current exhibition, Henry Scott Chuuk. The exhibition has been curated by our former Bryce curator, Dr. Cecil Robinson, and accompanied by a new and fantastic Yale University Press catalogue. If you haven't had the chance to visit, please do so before it closes on Sunday. The exhibition explores the work, life and legacy of Chuuk as an enigmatic Edwardian painter, best known for his nude studies of youthful male bodies on the Cornish coast. Navigating the shifting social, artistic and sexual dynamics of the late 19th and early 20th century, the exhibition has probed many challenging questions for both us as curators and our audiences. How should these works be viewed and received? What methods of display and interpretation are appropriate? How do we ensure that this exhibition is contextualized and approachable for a contemporary viewer without the erasure of particular narratives? These questions and more are what we hope to explore in tonight's panel discussion, bringing together the viewpoint of an artist, an educator, a curator and an activist. We hope that this evening will look beyond the Watts Gallery's exhibition programme to discover the curatorial and artistic negotiations that happen when we display and encounter historic material within the contemporary museum or gallery environment. And so I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Edwin Kumasari to chair tonight's talk. Not only does he have a wealth of art historical and curatorial knowledge, but Edwin was also part of our workshops in the lead up to the opening of our Henry Scott Chuuk exhibition, helping to guide the interpretation and programming for this exhibition season. Edwin is a historian of modern and contemporary art. He has been awarded postdoctoral and research fellowships at Edinburgh University next year, the Paul Mellon Centre 2020 to 2022, and the Courtauld Institute of Art 2018 to 19, where he earned his PhD. In 2021, he also worked as a freelance research assistant on an anti-racist and decolonial resource portal for the Association of Art History, and he currently convenes the Courtauld's Gender and Sexuality Research Group. Edwin, huge thanks for chairing tonight's discussion, and now I'll hand over.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. So it's a real pleasure to be here. As Nerissa just said, my name is Edwin Kumasaru. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre and the host for tonight's panel discussion. I am really thrilled to welcome our speakers here this evening: art historian and campaigner Alice Procter, artist Matt Smith, and educator John Sleigh. I'll introduce them properly before they speak, but first I'm just going to say a few brief words about the theme for tonight's conversation. Over the next hour and a half, we will discuss challenging curations and the contemporary viewer, organised on the occasion, as Nerissa said, of the Henry Scott Chuuk exhibition at the Watts Gallery. Although our conversation will not be limited to Chuuk, I thought it would be helpful for me to say something brief about his practice to begin. For those of you who aren't already familiar, Chuuk was a British artist, born in 1858 and who died in 1929. Some of his most notable works are paintings of nude boys and young men by the coast. In his catalogue essay for the show, art historian Michael Hatt reflects that, quote, while 21st century eyes are more likely to view them with suspicion as covertly sexual, the success and popularity of these works makes it clear that the bathing boy or youth was a completely legitimate genre in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And many such paintings adorn the walls of exhibitions, galleries, and homes. It is precisely this tension that I want us to unpack here tonight. What are 21st century eyes? And what does it mean to invoke them? How should curators exhibit historic objects, often euphemistically described as difficult? And does the binary between past and present in Hatt's framing potentially gloss over certain questions about power that underpin heritage institutions, especially organisations that aim to conserve and preserve? I'm not suggesting that Hatt minimises critical engagement with Chuuk. Rather, the opposite is true. The text delves into the complexities surrounding his portraits. Perhaps it is unfair to give so much consideration to a single sentence in Hatt's complex and thoughtful essay on queer readings of Chuuk's work. But I'm interested in the tension between different receptions then and now that Hatt describes. Museums often create the impression that they freeze objects in or outside of time, situating them in a linear temporal narrative. Historian Priya Satia's book, Time's Monster, considers how history as an intellectual discipline in the UK developed hand in hand with Britain's empire. She writes, quote, the conviction that history is necessarily a story of progress licensed liberal imperialists to heroically remake other places in the world in service to historical progress. In a feedback loop between certain intellectuals and troops or administrators, each aimed to justify the other. Not only was this myth that a supposedly modern Britain spread enlightenment through colonialism just propaganda, but its deeper narrative structures were also deployed whenever sympathizers of white supremacy or empire wanted to dismiss criticism. Defenders of imperialist Cecil Rhodes' statue at Oriel College, Oxford, for example, have claimed that he was simply a man of his time, incorrectly implying that he was an uncontested figure in his lifetime. Similar arguments were made before slave trader Edward Colston's statue was toppled in Bristol last year, as though enslaved people did not have feelings about their own captivity, nor Britain any history of abolitionist activism. But I want to introduce tonight's panel discussion with these reflections in order to begin by insisting that past violence is not over, but ongoing in the present, and that we as contemporary viewers may have a considerable amount in common with people's past. With this in mind, how can or should difficult heritage be displayed? Beyond exhibition text panels or catalogue essays, how can we think critically about the larger institutional frameworks that host or hold the objects themselves? I think there is an opportunity here to consider what constitutes a museum, its political objectives, and its relationships to structures of power, and what happens to history itself as a discipline or a discursive medium if we challenge widespread public assumptions about its linear teleological structure. So finally, before I introduce our speakers, I would like to say a huge thanks to Nerissa for the invitation to take part in this event. I'm really excited to be here this evening. So without further ado, on our panel, we have Alice Procter, who is an art historian, writer, and educator. In 2017, she started the Uncomfortable Art Tours, unauthorized guided tours of British museums, exploring how major institutions came into being against a backdrop of imperialism. She's the author of The Whole Picture, The Colonial Story of Art in Our Museums and Why We Need to Talk About It, published last year with Cecil. Her work concentrates on the intersections of post-colonial art practice, the curation of historical trauma, and narratives of national identity. John Sleigh is learning curator, arts educator, and art history writer. He works nationally freelance as a specialist in fine art engagement with a diverse portfolio of arts institutions, museums, and heritage sites across the UK. Clients include the National Gallery, the National Archives, Historic Royal Palaces, the Art Fund, the V&A, the Government Art Collection, the Arts Council Collection. Prior to this, John worked for Birmingham Museums Trust and the Arts Collection in round one of the acclaimed ACE National Partners Programme. He produces, delivers, and consults on arts engagement. John has built a national reputation for innovation, applied ethics, and delivery of projects reflecting inclusive futures. He has a passion for challenging underrepresented narratives in art, co-producing with communities to bring their lived experiences to artworks for advocacy. And finally, Matt Smith is an artist whose practice involves unpicking the work of museums and shifting their and their visitors' points of reference. His exhibitions have included Queering the Museum at Birmingham Museum, Losing Venus at the Pitt Rivers Museum, Other Stories at Leeds University Art Collection, Flux, Parry and Unpacked at the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge, and a 31-note love song at the V&A. He has also been closely involved in collaboration with the University of Leicester in the National Trust's Prejudice and Pride project. Matt was artist in residence at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2015 to 2016. He's also won numerous awards, including the Maylis Grand Young Masters Prize for Ceramics and the Object of the Show at Collect at the Saatchi Art Gallery and the Brookfield Properties Prize. His work is held in numerous museum collections, including the V&A, the Fitzwilliam Museum, the Walker Museum, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, and Brighton Museum and Art Gallery. And he has been purchased by the Art Fund and Contemporary Art Society. He has a PhD from the University of Brighton and is Professor of Ceramics and Glass at Nosfak University, Stockholm, and a visiting fellow at the University of Leicester. So if you'd like to all turn your cameras on, I'm thrilled to have you all this evening. So our wonderful speakers are each going to give 5-10-minute presentations before we open out to a roundtable discussion. I think we'll go Alice, John, Matt. So Alice, if you'd like to take us off.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And I wanted to start by saying that my work is predominantly focused on how we deal with difficult history in the context of museums. So as a tour guide, an educator, and a writer, my goal is to try and make room for conversations about imperialism and often the violence that accompanies that within a museum space. I'm not by any means a specialist on Chuuk and his contemporaries, and I don't want to get too caught up in the specifics of his biography. I want to talk more generally about how we deal with difficult subjects or supposedly difficult subjects within a museum setting. So firstly, I want to make clear that I don't think there is such thing as difficult history. I think every history has the potential to be difficult. And the most important thing that we need to do is engage honestly and as transparently as possible with the narratives that we're engaging with. It's not as simple as saying that some subjects are harder than others. Some subjects just require different levels of care and consideration. I work primarily on the representation of colonial violence, and I don't believe that it's possible to make a complete separation between the past and the present and the way that events were viewed at the time by contemporaries and by us now. I also don't think it's worthwhile working too hard to separate the art from the artist. Just as a personal policy, I think that very quickly becomes needlessly granular, and we start to obsess over individual meaning over the actual context in which works were created. I think that personal biography is significant to interpretation, but we need to be thinking much more generally about the experience and interpretation of these objects throughout their lives, not only at the moment of their creation and not only in the present day. I want to talk through a couple of examples that I think are interesting cases for engaging with difficult or troublesome history. I firstly want to bring up the definition by Amy K. Levin of precarious knowledge. Instead of calling things difficult history, have a sense that every form of knowledge, every kind of historical narrative has the potential to upset or distress. Whenever we see something represented in a museum or a gallery space, there is a chance that the narrative being put forward can unsettle our sense of self and unsettle our view of the world. So this sense of precarious knowledge over difficult history is, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind. Anything can be distressing or unsettling, depending on how it's treated and how it's engaged with. So with that in mind, I also want to mention that I think while it's worthwhile attempting to bring empathy and consideration into museum spaces, the idea of a safe space is not a uniform problem solver. The narratives that we have around safe spaces can often lead to a kind of quite single-minded narrative of what harm and pain might look like. If we're told that a space is safe, it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge that. If that space is not in fact safe for you, but you're told constantly and repeatedly that it's meant to be safe, it can become very fraught and very difficult. I also want to be very clear that empathy is not a flawless solution. Individuals can be empathetic towards the stories that they're seeing represented in museums, but everyone will bring their own baggage to that. And we can't just rely on the emotional literacy of museum visitors. With that said, it's important to trust visitors and recognize that we are serving audiences and responding to audiences that have experiences and knowledge that goes beyond the scope of what a museum can necessarily provide. This is a painting by Titian. It's The Rape of Europa, and it's in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. The Gardner Museum currently has an exhibition on of Titian's Ovid paintings. So this and 5 other scenes taken from the Metamorphoses. Many of these scenes include representations of sexual violence. The Gardner Museum has chosen to address that really directly. The exhibition text and catalog is available online. Obviously, I am not able to see the show in Boston right now, but the discussion taking place around these works engages very directly and very honestly with the use of sexual violence as metaphor, allegory, aesthetic appeal in the work of artists like Titian and others. It's unusual to see a museum do this so directly and so honestly, and I think it's a really worthwhile example, because not only are the Gardner saying very honestly that these are scenes of sexual violence and they're engaging with that, they're also providing resources. There is a lot of information available through the exhibition website about shelters for sufferers of domestic violence and people who've experienced abuse, in order to try and give a real world, very tangible impact to this exhibition. As part of the show, there is also a piece commissioned by from Barbara Kruger. This is a very close crop that's been rotated of the Diana and Actaeon, which is another one of the paintings in the series, and it's on the side of the building. And again, it's about bringing out these questions of sexuality and violence as they're represented in the images. I wanted to include this because I think it's also worth keeping in mind that contemporary artists can be a huge part of the interpretation when we're working with precarious knowledge or difficult history, and allowing artists the space to respond to these histories and collections is something that I am personally very in favor of, and I would assume that the rest of the panel is too. I wanted to bring this up because there are plenty of other examples of museums not taking their duty of care towards their audiences seriously. There are many examples that I can think of galleries that include images of sexual violence, images by known abusers and predators, and they continue to display those works without any kind of contextual information or consideration. Nowadays, it's probably more common for an exhibition to be pulled than for a reevaluation of the narrative taking place within it. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but this Titian show at the Gardner is a really interesting example to me of what can happen when those difficult histories or precarious knowledge are faced head on. There are other examples. The Museum of Sex in New York included testament from models who said they had been abused by the Japanese photographer Nobuyoshi Araki in the exhibition of his work. They included text and testimony from survivors alongside the images that he'd taken sometimes of these same women. So there are ways of bringing this very direct, very honest confrontation in. It can be very painful, and museums have a responsibility to take care of visitors if that is the case. I'm mostly mentioning these examples to give you a context for some of the things that I think are interesting about how institutions can respond to histories of pain and histories of trauma. As I said, I'm not by any means someone who works on Chuuk, but I am someone who's interested in the way that museums tell stories, and particularly the ways that museums claim to serve the public. I am really looking forward to this discussion. And I hope that these are interesting examples that you can keep in mind for the rest of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Super interesting case studies. John, if you'd like to yours.
Hello, my lovely friends. Thank you so much for having me. Picking up on Edwin's introduction, but also some of the points that Alice just made, one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is the use of the term 21st century eyes and the larger foundation by which we're operating inside of that. And for me as an artist educator, for me as somebody that is concerned with the connection to the public, safeguarding the public through conversations, but also making sure that the works act as advocacy tools for them. I think the Equalities Act is a huge one to consider, something that Chuuk could only imagine and dream of, but is the foundation inside of our democracy. So as of 2010, the Equalities Act lists a number of protected characteristics. I've been working on this in association with the context of challenging curations and collections. And very much in the vein of Alice, I believe that every collection and every piece has the capacity to be challenging. It has the capacity to be painful. I think one of the most difficult things to encounter is when galleries and gallery educators or institutions define on behalf of their visitors what is painful, what is potentially triggering, what is unsafe, what is challenging. And I think it's very difficult and it's very nuanced in order to kind of get to the heart of that. I encountered that in a piece of curation that I did in 2019 that was tragically cut short by that horrible COVID. It's a project and a conversation that I had about No Outsiders. Now, No Outsiders, oh, excuse me. No Outsiders was a huge moment that emanated from Birmingham, which is the region that I'm from, but had national ramifications. It stems from an educator who was an assistant head at the school called Andrew Moffat MBE. He created a scheme of work for primary schools called No Outsiders that specialised in inclusion, that used storytelling and some books that were widely available in the UK and abroad in order to prepare children for modern life in Britain today, specifically based on the protected characteristics within the Equalities Act. He was met with a huge backlash in doing so. He had death threats. There were major protests that first of all started outside the school in Birmingham and then transferred to other areas in the country where No Outsiders was being taught. No Outsiders based itself on a presupposition of gentle and kind inclusion. It used these pieces in the media and books that are widely available to talk about a function of our society that is required by law and is required within school curriculum, which is diversity, to uphold the Diversity Act and to make sure that people know about equalities. You cannot opt out of modern Britain, essentially, in the education system. The fragment for me, though, was that I could see this media storm raging and poor Andrew Moffat and the school under intense media scrutiny, people camping outside the school protesting, media swarming all over it. There was a huge disconnect, I thought, between what was happening in the education system and what was happening in contemporary art and museum collections. But we're having the same conversations. And the pieces, for example, within Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, which is right next door to where this was happening, contain those narratives and contain a working knowledge in educators and the value system of how to uphold them. So I wanted to bring the two together. What was really difficult was initially getting hold of Andrew Moffat. Imagine seeing somebody working in the public sector, doing this amazing work, being subjected to a huge barrage of abuse and trying to get through to them. I think it was difficult in the sense that Andrew's socials and people contacting him, for example, were proliferated with not only death threats, but also well wishes and people wishing him on and wanting him to do well within this. The cacophony of voices was enormous. Getting through that cacophony of voices and then starting to build trust with Andrew was an ongoing process that took over 6 months. When we talk about challenging curation, when we talk about engaging with works that have the potential to challenge us, when we talk about works that carry with them pain that is associated either with transgenerational narratives or larger narratives that tap into community pain that we experience, like queering, for example, here. What was fascinating was getting hold of somebody and then building the trust in order to have those conversations. Now, one of the key narratives that Andrew was celebrating within No Outsiders was LGBTQ+ narratives and the inclusion of queer people in education system, in people's lives in general. He wasn't asking for celebration, he was asking for baseline recognition in terms of an education system. Something that galleries and pieces of art in particular have a really key and dynamic role, I believe, in teaching people, particularly when they're in public ownership. I reached out to Andrew and I worked on a project called Applying the No Outsiders programme to Your Collection. It was in partnership with the Pitt Rivers Museum, University of Oxford, Museums Association, and Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. Specifically, it was taking key examples of very common pieces that are proliferating collections across the UK and showing directly how you can apply them to the protected characteristics of the Equalities Act, and more broadly, how they can support teachers that are delivering no outsiders. It struck me that teachers across the country are delivering no outsiders. They're coming to museums and art galleries anyway by default, yet the pieces exist there. Do they know that there's the connection there? Or are we enabling educators and curators within gallery spaces to be able to highlight that in a useful way of service towards the people that come in? ISIS and the Egyptians was one of the first ones that leaped out to me in terms of Pitt Rivers. Due to Britain's colonial past, you'd be hard pushed not to find Egyptian art and Egyptian artifacts across this country. There is a proliferation that is near saturation in some collections, but buried within those are conversations that directly support LGBTQ lives and the Diversity and Inclusion Act. Specifically with Isis, there's a really beautiful myth in the Greek tradition of Isis that she facilitated marriage between two women, and that she was the goddess you would pray to if you didn't want to marry a man, that you would reach to Isis to allow you to have female love and to experience female love and marriage recognized within a society and a community. That narrative is completely overlooked in a lot of interpretation around Egypt, yet it's fundamental. And I think it's the question with challenging collections sometimes, or what is potentially challenging, of what's included and laying that information out. I thought there was an interesting dichotomy in terms of the Egyptians, that we would talk about, for example, that the Egyptians would marry and have children with their members of family in incestuous relationships, but we wouldn't talk about the fact that Isis was someone you pray to have a same-sex marriage that is contemporary to now. I think enabling and making sure that people are aware of those, embedding it in a wider context, speaks to me about the notion of what we are doing in terms of challenging curation, which that it exists in a wider context, a wider legal framework, a wider moral framework, and a wider values-led framework in terms of how these pieces function for people. And that's the giveaway for me. They should function for people. Making sure that I connected these objects to outsiders was absolutely key for me. Another piece that we used, for example, was Ford Maddox Brown, and it's a piece about emigration. It talks about narratives of traveling to and from different countries, emigration, finding new homes, integration of cultural identity. Again, we applied it to no outsiders, making sure that conversations on queering, for example, which the media highlighted and was one of the main bones of contention in terms of no outsiders, sits within a wider remit of conversations that are happening on equalities. As I started to consider this project and the notion of challenging curation, I came back to me and what I consider challenging. I think there's a really interesting conversation that when we engage with collections in conversations that are seen as political or are seen as divisive in some way, that a core, very traditional audience would not enjoy this. Therefore, it's default difficult. Queerness becomes default difficult. And I don't think that's the case at all. It already exists out there in plain sight. It's acknowledging it and making it link up. I think there's conversations around trust, which are huge in terms of this. Are our institutions trustworthy? Are the collections trustworthy? Are the people that represent those, the educators, are they trustworthy in terms of these conversations? Have we earned the right to be part of these conversations? But I think foremost for me, there's a conversation that arose around bravery, and it was seen as a brave act to connect very traditional Victorian art that is considered safe with a very dynamic political and divisive circumstance that was happening within contemporary society. I didn't see that as brave. I think it's necessary. I think when I consider the values of taking part, I'm more scared of not engaging with the conversation and these objects either not being used or being irrelevant than taking part in the conversation in the first place. And I think that's the filter by which I access challenging or underrepresented narratives. I'm more scared of not doing so than of doing so. Thank you, Edwin.
Thank you. That was very powerful. Like Alice, fantastic case studies, really interesting projects, and I'm super excited to talk about them all together. After our final speaker, Matt, welcome, Matt. We'd love to hear a few words from you.
And thanks for inviting me today. When I was thinking about this challenge, the challenging, looking at challenging curating, and I just that's so has been world cultures I met previous I heard a talk by the amazing bird
Matt, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I think we're having some slight trouble with your audio. Is there any chance you could restart? I think we've lost your camera as well.
Okay, let me 1 second.
So sorry.
Or not.
I still can't.
Okay.
Perhaps while Matt sorts that out, we can have a chat, just the three of us, in anticipation for his great presentation, which will be coming. A question, I really love both your presentations. Thank you so much. I found them super interesting and engaging. And something a question that came to me while listening to them that I was just wondering about. It might seem like, on the one hand, a slightly obvious or totalizing question, but nevertheless, I was just wondering in the back of my mind. I just wanted to ask you, what is care, particularly in this context? And just because there's this line by Sarah Ahmed that just kept cropping up in my mind, where she says, abuse is often narrated as care. So I suppose I'm quite interested in how care itself is both quite contentious and also perhaps something that, in particular in a pandemic, we have been talking about a lot. So I was wondering if either of you would like to say something about care as a subject.
This is interesting. Yeah, I am also familiar with that quote, and I think it's such an interesting way of thinking about how museums tell stories, especially when we consider the narrative that often these institutions are putting forward, that they are the only place that can take care of these objects, or the only place that can take care of these stories. And this idea of custodianship is so contentious. I would say that care in the context of exhibitions like this one and like other possibly difficult narratives is about recognizing who the most vulnerable people in that space and conversation are, and trying to center and prioritize their voices. So that might mean recognizing that an exhibition's themes or subject matter could be potentially triggering to different groups, different demographics, different people of different experiences, and trying to not focus on that narrative to the exclusion of all others, but to give space and respect to the vulnerability that people will be bringing to that show and that space. It's not perfect. I think one of the reasons this question is so hard to answer is that I do genuinely struggle to think of cases where museums have taken appropriate levels of care. But when we see institutions and exhibitions that are very much informed by trauma or represent narratives of violence and trauma, often the most effective displays that I can think of are ones that recognize the pain that these stories can bring up.
I think there's a really interesting question around the use of the word care as well, because I think care implies that it's based on a level of voluntary morality to a certain extent, or that it's something benevolent that is given to people that we should be grateful for. And I think, particularly in terms of museums and collections, I think there's a real argument to say that we are the driving forces within these collections. We own them if they're in public ownership, they are stewarded for us, they contain our lived experience, they contain valuable aspects of our community identity, or they have the potential to inform our identities. They are huge triggers as well in terms of emotion. And I think it's interesting that a number of conversations around museum or gallery artifacts or pieces of art, for example, is always very clinical and very practical. I'm consciously coming across a number of risk assessments in art galleries, for example, where there are 3-page, 5-page, 10-page risk assessments for what happens if you trip over in an art gallery and you graze your knee. But where's the care in terms of emotional trauma that can come up in these works? They're almost, for me, like nuclear explosions that's happened. The walls are still a fallout in terms of what's there. That pain isn't negated by time or distance. And I think one of the primary fundamental pillars of care is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement, first of all, acknowledgement that these have this potential to happen. But secondly, acknowledgement that the institutions and the practitioners are constantly learning from others, from the communities whose lived experience are informed by them. We're taught in Western society that museums and art galleries are the arbiters of the truth, and they contain the final answer, they contain solutions, they're the full stop. And for me, they're very good at commas or question marks at best. And I think care is highlighting that.
Fantastic. Thank you, both of you. Those were fantastic answers and super thought-provoking. There are some things that I would really like to, some threads I'd like to pull on. But first, we have to hear Matt's fantastic presentation. Welcome back, Matt.
It's very much the shame of living somewhere rural. When it starts, there was a bit of a shower and the rain really affects the broadband. I'm not blaming other people watching videos, so I'm sorry about that, guys. Should we give this one another go?
Yes. Sounds.
Thanks a lot. Okay, hi. So fingers crossed, second time lucky. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've done with the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford that's currently live at the moment. This is the Pitt Rivers, and it's a museum of world culture. And when I started working with the Pitt Rivers, I had in mind a talk I'd heard a few years previously by Bird LaBird, and she put up a map of, contemporary map of where it's illegal to be gay. And she placed this next to a map of the British Empire. And while it's not a complete overlap, there's enough commonality to think there's some sort of link here. And I was interested when I got the opportunity to work with an ethnographical world cultures museum to try and unpick this a little bit and see what we might do within the museum to address this. Museums have been a bit bad at queer love, but they're a bit rubbish at love in general. So I'm not going to take it overly personally. Of the love tokens at the Pitt Rivers, museums tend to divorce their objects from the people who loved them or gave them or cared for them. And they tend to remove affect, if at all possible, and stop emotions coming in too much. The Pitt Rivers has a number of love tokens, and they're all recorded with what they're made of and when they were acquired. None of them talk about who they were given by or who they were given to. With this one exception, which is unusual, it's a cricket-related love token, and we're never going to know what team the giver batted for, but we do know that they've got a permanent reminder here that they do love Dick, and they're happy to embroider that. You know, they're happy to have that on a love token. So if museums are a bit rubbish at love, which they are, I decided I'd better start with grief instead. And grief has been just love, but grief is love with nowhere to go. So specifically, I started, sorry for the bouncy arrow, but I love them. I started with this object here, the Chief Mourner's costume. It was collected during Captain Cook's voyages to the South Pacific, and it led me into a little rabbit hole of investigation into those voyages. So Cook's voyage was supported by both the British Admiralty and also the Royal Society. And the initial aim was to record the transit of the planet of love, Venus, from Tahiti. And the idea, which is way beyond my maths knowledge, is that observing the passage of Venus between two different points on the Earth, you can then calculate, well, somebody else can, I can't, but apparently somebody else can calculate the distance of the Earth from the sun, and from that, the size of the solar system, which I think other people might find useful. Now, after Cook had recorded the transit of the planet Venus, he was to open a second set of sealed instructions just from the Admiralty. And this is when it gets exciting. Those instructions told him to go off and find new lands. And what began as a journey of discovery to observe the planet of love became a voyage to claim land and wealth for the British Empire. So the Cook expeditions were seen as scientific voyages of discovery, and on the boat were botanists and artists who documented what they encountered. And in line with Enlightenment thinking, they recorded what they saw with a so-called objectivity. Unfortunately for me, I worked with ceramics a lot. At the same time as Cook was sailing around the world doing all sorts of dodgy dealings, Josiah Wedgwood was setting up his ceramics factory in the West Midlands. And Wedgwood made celebratory dinner services. And in this famous one, the Frog Service, which was made for Catherine the Great, you can see that Wedgwood's placed in images of famous British buildings and landscapes, these conspicuous displays of power, ownership, and control over nature. So I was interested with this in mind, what would Wedgwood have done to commemorate Cook? And so I started making the Cook service, which is the Wedgwood dinner service that Cook never made. So I thought I'd do it for him. And again, looking at ideas of landscapes and portraits recorded on the voyages as a starting point. So these recorded images from Weber's prints from the voyages are in brown, and juxtaposed with them in pink are classical images of Venus, the Roman goddess of love. So merging European scientific recordings of the South Pacific with completely fabricated myths and folklore from Europe, because scientific rationality only kind of worked one way. And these plates got placed with platters illustrating the tools that the Europeans used to help people understand how good colonization was going to be for them. And it was this clash between European objectivity and the recording of other people that led me to start looking at the photographic archives, and specifically the work of Henry Evans within the museum. These images use a disturbing, systematic, and supposedly scientific recording of difference, which mapped what was visible to the viewer, but to certainly my eyes, removed the humanity of the subject. And I was interested in exploring how this combination of scientific recording and erasure of emotion could be addressed. One of the unexpected exports to follow Cook's land grab was the export of British laws to countries that had been colonised. So from the 1860s onwards, the British Empire imposed legal codes criminalising male-to-male sexual relations. And these codes still impact today, with over half of the countries with anti-gay laws being once subject to British colonial rule. So these laws are still limiting who can love and whether people can be visible about who they are. So I'd argue that what started with a voyage looking for love resulted in the British Empire selecting what types of love were allowed. So going back into the photographic archive, I started selecting images of people from countries that had been subjected to British colonial rule. 7 photographs were selected and each one turned into a screen print. The photographs were all taken where Britain had either imposed or maintained homophobic legislation. It was argued that this legislation was mostly a response to colonial panic about Western behaviour overseas, but the impact on the local population was to change how many societies viewed same-sex love and gender diversity. So adopting the geometric patterns from Evans' photographs and adapting them, the humanity was erased from the images until all that remains is what people wore and what they owned, and in some ways mirroring how museums prioritize material culture over emotion and effect. But desire is persistent. Unintentionally, out of 7 photographs, 4 were taken by the same photographer, Wilfred Thesiger, whose writing about men contains references to his own queer desire. And within the museum, we often rely solely on written evidence to validate our knowledge. And with histories of homophobia, queer knowledge was seldom recorded or preserved. We're therefore left with a gay and lesbian history as a repressed archive, with the historian doing some intrepid archaeological digging through homophobic erasure to find the truth. That I was repeatedly drawn back to Thesinger's images with no prior knowledge of his biography, I think lends weight to Robert Mill's assertion that our encounters with archives are saturated with desire, and sometimes we should just believe that regardless of the documentation, when we know, we know. So the Ethnographic Museum used to be a scholarly backwater, and over the last 20 years has really moved into the forefront of cultural disputes. The Pitt Rivers is undergoing major renovations in how it listens and works with people from around the world, and with the emotional connections those people feel with the collections. The desire to understand the effect of actions taken by those who came before us is something that I think we in Britain could do much better. I think we need to recognise Britain's part in the systematic, international epistemicide, which has erased queer ways of being. Stuart Hall argues that you're only aware of your identity when it's unaligned with those of the people around you, or in this case, unaligned with the legislation imposed upon you. I think it's kind of all too easy to assume that queerness has no place in the Pitt Rivers Museum, and that looking for queer relevance there is a 21st century rereading of the collections. But the effect of British Victorian heteronormative collectors acquiring objects from countries subjected to British homophobic legislation has ensured that queer narratives and biographies were very unlikely to ever make it into museum records. And I think this is kind of more than just a museological debate. From our current position of newfound relative tolerance, I think we should be showing that we care and working to help people achieve the basic human rights of being able to be who they are and being able to love who they love. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was so powerful.
So I'm just relieved the web didn't crash. I'm so relieved.
That was really beautiful. Thank you. I love that line that John mentioned in the chat. Grief is love that has nowhere to go. I thought that was very poetic. Thank you. All 3 of you have presented some super interesting and important projects, and I think there's so much to unpack here. While your internet was down or while you'd restarting Zoom, Matt, I asked John and Alice what care meant. I don't know if I noticed in your final closing lines you used that term. I don't know if that's something you'd like to say anything about, or if you'd be I mean, the other thing that I also kind of want to that was coming out in John and Alice's response was about power and authority in relationship to care. So perhaps that's something that you'd like to respond to.
Yeah, I think curating is a really selective business, and any object has got 100 stories to tell, and curators decide which ones they're going to choose. And for me, I think absence and erasure are possibly the most triggering things you can find in a museum. And to have lives that are deemed as unsafe to talk about or not worth including, I think is incredibly problematic. And I think, I love John's point about the Equalities Act, which is really strong legislation that, this is not arbitrary anymore. There's a legal framework governing what public sector organizations do. And I think we've hopefully moved on a long way from the idea of Section 28 and erasure. But I think public sector organizations, many of them are still really struggling with this, and what they might see as challenging curating, I just see as a basic human right and a basic human, it's their basic duty, it's what they're employed to do. So I think there's this language of challenging or difficulty is, I think is up for debate quite a bit.
Absolutely, yeah. Something that I really loved in your talk, and that actually I'd also like to ask John and Alice about, is emotions and museums or museum spaces. And I'm sure both John and Alice will have had their own experiences of that too, because it struck me very noticeably in the way you were talking about those colonial histories and the Pitt Rivers Museum, was that there was this performance, at least historically, and I'm sure there's an enduring legacy today, of a kind of scientific detachment, which in of itself is a profoundly violent process. So yeah, I was wondering if each of you could say something about emotion in museum spaces, or with objects, how you've encountered them.
I think for me, there was a really big lightning bolt of how can I convey to audiences that they have the power to not only hold me accountable, but question what's happening. And I think in museum and gallery spaces, I found that a number of people defer to the members of staff or the academics or the tour guides just automatically based on these massive kind of post-colonial institutions that they walk in and they're hoping to be presented with the answer, and they trust us inherently to kind of give that answer in a number of cases. And I think in terms of my own practice and the tours that I run, I'm constantly saying to people, are you sure? Are you sure? Where's my bias? You're presuming I'm neutral. I'm really not neutral. And I think if we're coming to if we're coming to anything to do with queering, for example, whether that be Chuuk, whether that be other forms of queer erasure or queering within galleries, I'll become really, really passionate. And I will say it's because I'm queer. Not only that, I grew up under Section 28. I'm angry and queer. You need to understand where this is coming from in terms of that dynamic. I am by no stretch of the imagination neutral on this, and to be apologetic for emotion, I think, is wrong when we are conveying pieces that have the potential to literally change people's lives, their perceptions, the way they communicate with other people, to uplift them in really bad times, or conversely, to really damage them. And I think there is a real power in terms of acknowledging where that emotion is coming from. There was an instance I encountered when I was working with Derek Jarman's work, for example, which again in the queering bracket comes under, for some people, queer fear. It comes under, for some people, challenging or contested histories. Again, very much like Matt, it's not for me because I'm talking about my life. I'm talking about my heart. I'm talking about the desire that I feel. I'm talking about the care and the filter by which I approach the rest of society. I was talking about Derek Jarman's work, and there was a piece that I was talking about that was specifically made 2 years before Derek Jarman's death as a result of complications around HIV and AIDS. And I'd breathlessly for about 10 minutes been waxing on about how amazing this piece was, context, historical relevancy, artistic technique. I was really giving it everything because I cared about this piece. And then I said, again, breathlessly, anyone got any questions? And someone turned around to me and said, have you got HIV? And I was absolutely floored by that question because it was such an invasion of my personal boundaries. It was such an invasion of me in terms of the dynamics of what was there. What was the right answer in that case? To give an answer would give them credence to invade my personality and my life even further. If I denied it, am I playing into a sense of shame that I don't feel? There was a real counterbalance there. And I think emotion can lead to emotional boundaries being lowered. And I think queering is a really good example of that. That had we been talking about something else, or a very quiet Victorian landscape that's very twee and very boring, and you'll get it on a postcard and you'll forget about it tomorrow. If we'd have been talking about that, would they have felt enabled through the emotional exchange we were having to ask me such a personal question that violated my privacy? And I think that's where the emotion lies for me, in the sense that it's a fault line sometimes for barriers to be lowered, and particularly in public spaces, to encounter behaviour that is really quite challenging sometimes.
In a kind of adjacent issue, a lot of my work is about discomfort and what happens when you are presented with a story that you disagree with or are unfamiliar with, particularly when it comes to telling stories of colonialism. A lot of my work is about talking people through the process of recognizing sort of the faults and the flaws in the histories that they've been taught or that they've taken for granted. And very often the instinctive reaction to that is defensiveness. Even the most kind of sensitive and self-aware people will often react with a kind of like shock and defensiveness when you start to talk them through things that they've taken for granted that are not necessarily true, mistakes that have been embedded in their understanding of history. So I think discomfort in a museum space is a profoundly powerful emotion. It can encourage us to think through our own biases and our own experiences, as well as helping us recognize sort of the flaws in the narratives that we've internalized. So working with the idea of feeling uncomfortable, I think, is a really powerful use of emotion personally. I also think it can be a very radical thing to cry in an art gallery or a museum and to express kind of quite, I don't want to say pure, but unfiltered emotion can be a really important action, whether that's from grief or from love or from excitement or anger. I think any expression of genuine and sincere emotion can be really transformative to the museum space, not just in terms of your own experience and your own interaction with an object. It breaks down this sense of distance and objectivity and forces everyone around you, for better or for worse, to realize that that is impossible. And I think that kind of confrontation with emotion can be a really significant act. I'm not suggesting that people should go to art galleries specifically to cry, although if you want to do that, I think that's actually kind of a great idea. But if you want to feel things in a museum, you should do it. You have the space and the potential to express and explore emotions. Don't hurt yourself and don't hurt those around you. And maybe probably don't hurt the objects, but express emotion in a genuine and sincere way. And that will affect your experience and your understanding of the space and the experience of those around you.
Thank you both. That was such really, really powerful reflections. I really appreciate that. Is there anything you'd like to say, Matt, about emotional?
Yeah, I think there's nowhere I'm as emotionally incontinent as a museum. So I just don't, I kind of don't get it. I find objects incredibly powerful. But what I'm interested in is why museum labeling is so emotionally dead inside. And what I want is a dialogue with the people who know about objects. And I think this kind of anonymity that comes in with museum labeling quite often can make me feel like it's been curated by a committee of, I don't know, of people who just aren't in touch with themselves. And I kind of would much rather have signed labels where I know who's talking to me, whose biased opinion is coming out. And I kind of think, for me, that would be a much healthier dialogue.
I mean, I think that sounds like an excellent idea. I'd love to see that.
I'd quite like John and Alice to write the labels, though, to be honest.
There's a project in that. A question I'd like to ask all of you, although just to remind our audience, by the way, if you do have any questions, please just post them in the chat and I will ask them to our speakers as we go along. But a question, and I think this has been a theme that's been running through your presentations and our discussion so far, is about authority and the authority that museums perform and the politics of that. Is there anything you'd like to say about either the performances of that authority or ways in which you have seen it disrupted?
So I would like to just start off that kind of conversation by reminding everyone that museums are also sites of the abuse of authority and the abuse of power, not just in the way that they present stories, but within staffing structures and in terms of how different individuals are treated, like on an interpersonal basis and also on an institutional level. Like there's a huge amount of abuse and violence and trauma that takes place within museums, within staff rooms, as well as in terms of how these stories are told. So when we think about how museums can be sort of more considerate or more caring, or we see an exhibition that's wearing its feelings on its sleeve and talking very heavily about, you know, its credentials as a safe space and its sense of care, we do also have to think about what is going on behind the scenes and recognize that that might not match up with the face that's being put forward. This might be in terms of, you know, anti-union action or the abuse and violence towards individual members of staff and things like that. So when we talk about the way that museums treat these stories, we have to also look at how they're running the show.
Absolutely, and that, like you say, also extends to employment practices and, you know, them as, you know, who they're investing in, all those sorts of things. Matt or John, is there anything you'd like to respond to?
Well, I was going to say I really love Alice's. So I'm just going to big up Alice for a minute. I love that your practice is not endorsed by the institution, but has taken on an absolute core part of the debate about what museums are. I just, hats off to you, not waiting to get a job, not asking for permission. These are the things that people should be doing, and so few of us do. So yeah, a big hats off to you, Alice. I think as an artist who works with museums, it's a really odd situation that I very seldom get paid by a museum. I usually get funding from the Arts Council or another organisation. And then I come in with quite a big voice. And I think it's quite an interesting one that artists are used to disrupt status quo. And I don't know if that's because we're seen as not quite serious enough, so it's okay, or that we're on short-term contracts, so they get rid of us quite quickly. I don't know, but I kind of I mean, for me, it's been great, but I'm wondering why museums don't feel that they can do these challenging retakes of history on their own, and why it's left to people like me or Alice maybe to come in with those.
What do you think, John? Is there, because I'm really, I mean, what Matt just said is very fascinating, and I have noticed this, and I don't mean this entirely critically, but this practice of institutions asking artists to not solve problems, but kind of deal with really big questions of power and violence, and then, you know, often there's a short-term contract and it's all over. And but that's also not to say that artists themselves don't bring an imaginative capacity and a critical thinking and a profound ability to dwell in ambiguities and to rethink our world. John, do you have any thoughts about both the potential or sometimes the co-optation of artists in museum spaces?
Yeah, I think as a gallery educator that has represented both institutions, collections, and then kind of freelanced all around, I think the initial reaction I have is that I accrue a vast amount of power very, very quickly, accidentally in a number of cases, just by living very loudly and being very present in front of objects. And I find that really personally quite alarming, because my practice is rooted in trying to disestablish as much of my privilege as possible, a lot of the privilege which I've inherited. But then on top of that, particularly with contested pieces and marginalized communities, I think it's making sure that there's a constant give back, that they are getting more from that exchange than the institution is. So I think there is a power dynamic that's going on inside of that. I think as well in the industry at large, when we're dealing with artworks and art pieces or museum collections that are labelled as challenging or contended or contentious, I think it's who is carrying the power in terms of the voice, but also who's carrying the authority in terms of the emotional labour that's going on inside those conversations. And I think as a queer person, sometimes I am conscious that queer communities, for example, are called upon to, or sometimes required or expected, to have conversations around our lived experience, our trauma, our community history and heritage that exist within objects, but with a default voice in order to have that. And I think for me, power authority is making sure that everyone in this institution is part of that conversation. Everyone is sharing that load equally. I think there's a really interesting power dynamic that sometimes the people that are the most traumatized by these conversations are the ones that are called upon to have the most emotional labor during these conversations. So I think there's lots of different power dynamics happening inside of that. I think the most important thing for me on power authority is acknowledgement and transparency that this is happening, to not sit in power and authority, but to constantly be getting people to challenge them on that. I think, for example, when I do gallery tours, some people are terribly polite with me and they say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, would you mind awfully if I disagreed with you?" And I'm like, please, God, do disagree with me. Knock me off this milk crate. Like, give me what you feel. And I think where there's lots of power structures at play, but enabling people to have autonomy in terms of their voice, and touching on something that Matt said as well, a queer feeling is enough within these spaces. We don't need a smoking gun. I don't need it categorically listed on a wall to tell me that something is queer. If I feel it's queer, that's enough for me. And I think enabling audiences to have that conversation is crucial in power.
Thank you. I think that's such a brilliant response and so thoughtful. Nerissa has a fantastic question specifically about interpretation and labeling. She says, in response to Matt, although I would love to hear what all of you think, who should be responsible for the interpretation? is the curator slash the educator slash the public slash external voices, or in the case of contemporary exhibitions, the artists themselves? Should the interpretation be honest, e.g., this is a difficult work to talk about, so we're not going to attempt? Or do you, and any feelings?
I feel like, first of all, you've got to say, this is a difficult work to talk about, so we're going to take our time and do it really carefully, rather than just cutting it off. I think everyone has a role to play in that. I have said this before, I am in favor of lots and lots of interpretation. Personally, I think exhibitions are too big, and they would be better if we took a more focused look at a smaller number of objects and took more time and consideration and depth over a narrower pool of stories than, you know, a big blockbuster show. That's my personal problem. But I am in favor of a kind of level of depth and consideration. You know, different people have different expertise and experience, and a curator tells a different story to an educator, tells a different story to an artist, and that's great. That's the idea. I just want people more than anything to remember that when we talk about objects and we look at their biographies, we're not seeing a tidy story. We're seeing usually hundreds of years of palimpsest, of people writing over each other and contradicting each other and coming up with different ideas and interpretations. And that is really, really important. It can be very satisfying and rewarding and weird and fun when you see the way that a specific object has been described by its different curators. You know, you can compare gallery labels going back however far you want and see these very different stories being told and these very different narratives being highlighted. And I think that's great.
Absolutely, yeah. Matt or John, do you like to?
Yeah, I think, God, I just want accountability. Is it going on sale? I just want accountability. I kind of want to know who's written the label. And I'd like to know what their relationship to the organisation or the exhibition is. So I've got an idea as to the background that they're coming at it with. But kind of going back to kind of the absence and erasure, I go back to the Alexander Mcqueen show at the V&A that was happy to talk about him feeling a bit Scottish and his dad being a London taxi driver, but would not mention that he was queer and would not talk about his mental health and his suicide. And I just think, actually, if you're balancing the narrative of Alexander Mcqueen, is his dad being a taxi driver more important than those other two messages? And I think we really need to pull up organizations when they're erasing important, when key parts of the story are being erased. And I wasn't part of the committee, so I don't know why they were erased, but I think it says some very damning things about who is welcome and what bodies are acceptable within that exhibition space.
Oh, Matt, I do love you. That was such a beautiful answer. I think for me, it's taking the notion of interpretation and challenging that it's finite, that just because the label is written, that's how it needs to stay. The interpretation that is happening right now is the interpretation that we are left with until the end of time, or that either a co-community action or a violent act changes it. And we know from learning, from working with communities in art galleries and art settings, they inform the sociology of these pieces. If I work with a group and they testify and bring lived experience to a piece of art and expand the institution's knowledge, I expect that to be reflected in the text. I expect it to be reflected in the curatorial file. And I think it's changing our expectation that just because a label or an interpretation text starts in an exhibition, it doesn't need to stay that way. It can be rewritten. It can be as dynamic as the people coming inside of it. So I think, building on what Alice and Matt said, I think I would also add that we need to hold exhibitions, particularly ones that contain challenging narratives, accountable to be constantly updating. and making sure there is enough budget to reprint a label if a label needs reprinting, rather than that kind of like, we'll tough it out till the end and hopefully we'll learn something. I think these spaces are dynamic. They're changing as people go into them, and the artworks are too. They don't exist in their time, they exist in our time, and they should be subject to our rules.
Thank you. I think that's such a fantastic way of putting it, and actually dislodges some of the techniques of performing power that museums often do, where they situate things in a kind of timeless realm. I've just got a question from Ellen. She'd like to ask whether the panelists feel that contentious subjects can somehow be cushioned by being wrapped in biography or chronology. Do they feel that this contributes to the erasure of narratives? Do you have any feelings about
that? I think I'd kind of go back to any object can have 100 different stories. So it's not even that they're wrapped up in biography. It's more just, you can just sideline any narrative you want to as a curator. And I'm conscious that there will be subjects that people don't feel equipped to talk about, but then get people in to help you. But it's, yeah, I think being uncomfortable is no longer a good enough reason to avoid very obvious narratives that visitors will be coming in expecting to see discussed around work. I think we're all a little bit more grown up now.
I think I would contrast two artists together to answer that question. So I would take an artist like Scott Chuuk, for example, that was hugely commercially successful, that died at an advanced age, that had the association of queer within his own lifetime and then beyond. And I would counterbalance that with an artist like Simeon Solomon, for example, who was one of his contemporaries, also a queer man. But Simeon Solomon's reputation, idea, our perception of Simeon Solomon falls into the category, I feel, of queer victimhood. Poor Simeon Solomon. He was subject to vicious abuse as a result of his active sexuality. He was imprisoned. He died as a result of addiction and poverty. He is the tragic figure, Simeon Solomon, in terms of his queering. And I think it gets so wrapped up in the package of the artist, his mythology, how he ended. We're not really talking about the artwork, but because Scott Chuuk was very successful, we're able to celebrate, for example, his virtuosity in terms of light and the application of light on skin tones. It was exceptional what he created. Similarly for Simeon Solomon, he equally created works of such great artistic value, but it's so wrapped up in poor Simeon Solomon, poor tragic Simeon Solomon, and it ties into queer victimhood, which is really quite difficult to unravel. So yes, I do believe there is a cushion.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think it's very easy sometimes to get very caught up in the idea of the biography, particularly when we talk about sort of the great man of history, and use that to dismiss what's actually happening. Kind of appropriately, it's the 50th, I think, anniversary of the death of Anna Mendieza, who is an artist whose life has been defined pretty much entirely by her death in terms of the way that her work is interpreted and seen in galleries. And that's a very strong example to me of someone whose actual biography has been overshadowed, you know, whose career has been overshadowed by their biography. It's difficult because the biography informs the art, but also I think a monographic show that becomes very obsessed with the details of someone's life loses sight of that. I mean, I also don't think you can have an exhibition completely devoid of biography, though. Like, something else that I was thinking about in preparation for this panel is the fact that there's an Alice in Wonderland exhibition on at the V&A at the moment. Charles Ludwig Dodgson, Lewis Carroll, is someone whose sexuality and desires, particularly towards young girls, has been significantly discussed and contested. It is going to be unclear forever what his real desires and beliefs were. But that show is, as far as I'm aware, almost entirely devoid of biography and focuses entirely on the legacy of one of his characters, who was based on one of these young girls that he was close to. It goes both ways, you know, you take the biography out and you lose context, you focus entirely on the biography and you lose the work. And that balance and negotiation is going to be different for every artist and different for every story.
I mean, thank you all for such perceptive answers. You know, I really appreciate having your insights. We've had, I appreciate we've only got 5 minutes left, which isn't a huge amount of time. But I've had an anonymous question that's quite interesting. And I don't know if we're going to have enough time to answer it all, but it also allows me the opportunity to pose a question that I have been thinking of during our discussion, which, like I say, we might not have time, which is also fine, because it may be unanswerable. But the anonymous question is, has the role of the singular authoritative curator had its day? And this, you know, made me think about the question that was, you know, going back and forth in my mind while we've been chatting, which is, you know, do museums enable or obstruct social change? And what do museums look like if you disperse authority? So given that we've only got 4 minutes, would any of you like to, I mean, you don't have to have neat answers, but do you have any kind of initial thoughts?
Can I come back about the authoritative curator? And I think the answer has got to be, it depends on the curator. So somebody like Claire Barlow, who did Queer British Art, it was her name and it was her authority that went through the show, but it was obvious that she'd done a huge amount of negotiation and consultation with people and thought laterally about the subject. So I think if the curator's strong enough, and sorry to pick out Claire in particular, then I think it's, yeah, why wouldn't you want somebody like that in charge of a show? I think the problem becomes when somebody thinks they have all the answers and none of us ever do, and isn't open to listening. I think that's when the singular authoritative curator becomes quite problematic.
My short, unneat answer is I have built my whole career on community co-curation and working with other people. An authoritative voice isn't something that I do or feel, and I rebel against it.
Yeah, I think as long as curators recognize that basically everything they're doing is at some level autobiography, you know, that it's okay to have an authoritative voice, but you've got to own up to the fact that you are being an author, instead of just some kind of invisible puppet master.
Yeah, I think, I mean, speaking in a capacity as someone who's not a curator, I think there's a tremendous power in being self-reflexive and self-critical and transparent. I think the other reason I asked that question about museums in general is because institutions, there's a tension between being a person in an institution and an institution exerting its kind of business as usual, or at least the gravity of its mechanics, I suppose. And in your own, if I say so myself, particularly brilliant ways, each of you have negotiated that tension, and have sometimes done things that museums have been enthusiastic about, and sometimes not. And they're wonderful projects, both, you know, in both situations. So I think we really are out of time. There are a couple of other super interesting questions that I would love to ask, but sadly can't. So I'd like to thank you all for such brilliant presentations and such wonderful and thoughtful discussion. I'm really grateful for having you here tonight.
And I just must add my thanks from the Watts Gallery to all of you. Thank you particularly to Edwin for navigating such a fascinating, powerful and exploratory conversation this evening. And it's been wonderful to work with you over the last couple of months, and in particular to bring this talk to fruition. So thank you, Edwin. And a huge thanks also to our panelists, to Alice, to Matt and to John for this incredible, insightful, personal and dynamic discussion. And I think there's lots of case studies for us to revisit and think critically about. And I know that I'll certainly be going into exhibitions and with a more critical eye. We've covered a lot of big subjects this evening: violence, power, education, inclusion, imagination and emotion in the museum space, the role of the artist, the curator, the educator and the visitor, and the power that they bring to the museum space as well. And as a practitioner and a museum professional working across exhibitions and programming, tonight has really encouraged me to think more about how I talk to my colleagues and to be brave enough to be accountable and self-reflexive in everything that I and my colleagues do within the public space. So thank you to all of you for invoking such a fabulous discussion. I'd like to close tonight by thanking all of our audience for coming along this evening, and thank you also to anyone who's attended any previous events in this exhibition season. It's been really fantastic to welcome you to our What's at Home programme. And for details of our autumn season and upcoming talks, courses and events, please see our website. We are launching our next exhibition, Uncommon Power, about Catherine and Lucy Maddox Brown. So Ford Maddox Brown, got to mention earlier. And that should open at the end of September. So please do come along to that. Thank you again, Edwin, Alice, Matt and John, for a fabulous evening, and good night. Thank you.